Today we have Jeff talking to us. Free to ask questions, use the mic if you do. He's going to talk about building the microservices side.
Yeah.
The floor is all yours.
Thanks, Dirk. A little bit about me. My name is Jeff Taylor. I'm a PM working in Corelogic. Recently, I've been working on microservices, and today I really just wanted to discuss some of the findings with computers going to sleep and how that affects our productivity. Actually, I wanted to ask who's ever been in a hedge maze? No. Did any of you guys star in The Shining? A hedge maze. Anybody know what a hedge maze is? Can you all hear me in the back? All right, it's all good. Well, a hedge maze, of course, is a maze that's been carefully landscaped and has a lot of interesting twists and turns. And this is really an allusion to what we're going to talk about today, which is sort of like a winding path to value. We started out with what do we define as services in the enterprise. I thought of three main things. I have a little bit of a background in marketing, so I love this rule of three. So you got to have three punchy period statements. And so we started out with traditionally services are hidden. They're always in the background. What I like to call is they've got faces for radio, and they're TV. They're TV ugly, but they usually are just underneath the surface. They're supporting a lot of the applications, which also leads to them being repeatable. So there are definitely things that you're doing all the time, and they allow you to sort of unlock this potential. And what also makes them repeatable is they become necessarily essential or critical. So we think about these things as traditionally making assumptions that they may not have users, or they may not necessarily be tied to the same things that an application would be. So we'll talk about that a little bit later and allude to why that might be not so correct. Have any of you guys seen The Time Machine or read The Time Machine? It's one of my favorite books growing up. It's got this fundamental paradigm of these people underneath the ground that are very, very awesome to look at, and they're in these highly contrasted. If you're looking at the 60s movie, they got some really interesting costumes there. But they're the Morlocks, and they are basically powering everything behind this upper level group called the Eloi. And the Eloi are these beautiful looking people. They get to do all the cool stuff. They get to interact with these gods, which are the users, and the Morlocks kind of feel that they're not as real as they think, because they understand all of the real world workings, and they exist in this totally underground society that's sort of funding this on what surface seems like this great society. So I like this analogy because you're looking at pushing up value, and there's this other thing that we've talked about. We'll sort of talk about this a little bit later, about how services go up to the actual user base. So I wanted to discuss with those assumptions, right? We're talking about building applications, and I love this picture because you're brazenly heading into the door with all the information that you feel like you need, but there's always this thing, you don't know what you don't know, somebody has pulled off the other two letters of the bathroom and you're headed right in. So I wanted to start out with using some of these assumptions and where we sort of came on this development process. I'll start with our innovative paradigm. So I came here to Pivotal with Corelogic in August of last year, and I got really, really excited about the process. We're doing all this great stuff where we can get scoping and inception and pre-IPMs, and then we can just start work. So what I said was, you know what? We're building services. They're completely different than applications. So you know what we need to do? We need to sort of adjust this process, this fantastic process, to what we need in services, because services is the ultimate goal. We had a group that was building POCs, and so we were looking at maybe getting some output for them and in a tech design. And then we would go into a scoping in which we would sort of talk about all the great stuff that come into the scoping meetings that you have here in Pivotal. And from that, we would sort of modify our tech design really quickly, because we'd understand everything. We'd know our bounded context. We'd create the design workflow. We wouldn't necessarily need to do user interaction designs. But we'd be ready to go with this information data flow and create our development inception, because these are services. They're repeatable, they're critical. All we need to do is just figure out what these applications need to do based on what the enterprise is telling us, and build all of our stuff in the icebox. So we do all that, and then we need to discover our definition of done and definition of ready, and then output our 2 iterations, and we're off. Notice that there's one critical thing that we're missing. What are we missing in this that you guys know from the process? I heard a couple. What was users? I heard one. Anything else? Any big diamond object that we might be missing in this process? I heard some things. Discovery. Yeah, and also the end. Great. Yeah, we'll talk about that too. Thanks. Yeah, so this was what we decided would be our excellent way to achieve. And we made a lot of mistakes here along the way. So we said that we wouldn't need user interviews because we don't necessarily have users. We know that their applications, we log onto the websites for the applications we're going to service. We figure that out. We look at their backlogs, whatever. We're going to replace people with machines. We don't need it. We don't have users. We have machines that we're dealing with. We have these things that we're trying to interact with that speak REST and other fantastic things. All we need to do is just understand what they do on the surface. It doesn't matter what that value actually is. And we did not include our non-consuming but influential people in the same aspects that we did with our users. We actually just said, what do you guys want out of this service? Let's just actually go and build it. And the thing that we had to learn was that there are always users, but just not where we thought, right? So after like a period of soul searching and expanding through the galaxy, we realized that those droids were in front of us all along. So it took us a long time for us. I think we worked with Lenny on this a lot. We had a lot of wandering in the desert, a lot of ways to find ourselves, a lot of things that we were searching for, but we didn't actually know what these answers were. And the traditional methods, the overall confidence that we had in what we were building was failing us because we thought we knew this entire universe, we thought it was well defined, but it kept introducing wrinkles to what we were trying to provide. So we noticed at some point that we needed to have a change. So we started thinking about what are services? What exactly are they? And we took the paradigm of an application where you have, again, these 3 big things: idea, users. You do something with an idea and the users, question mark, question mark, question mark, and you get profit. Just as the underpants gnomes told us. That's how you make great applications. So how can we do the same thing with services? So we decided that our ideas are not necessarily these great organic ideas like, how do I solve getting taxis to people with just people driving their cars? Nothing great like that. But what am I looking at in our fundamental systemic process that is causing some pain or that needs to be externalized? How can I get users in the form of apps to be excited about integrating with us, just as a user is excited to use something like Uber? And this is always the fun one, right? Revenue is a really interesting thing. Unless you're building a paid-for service, which sounds kind of weird. It sounds more like an application or a traditional end-user application. But how do we attribute all of this work? We've got thousands of applications integrating with us and we're feeling successful. How does that really contribute to the bottom line? Because ultimately that's what's important. And what we started to think about was cost savings. If we're consolidating a lot of these services, not only are we saving on physical assets like reducing the amount of storage solutions that we have, consolidating data centers, but we're also saving on rework, right? Not every team is reinventing the wheel. Not every enterprise is having to go through and remediate a lot of these apps because they're doing things the different ways. We're able to provide maybe some sort of standard or at least some consolidated approach to some of these well-trodden problems. And so we can start to enumerate this and how much money we can actually save the enterprise. So as we start to look at this, we're starting to evolve our thought process that services are actually just applications. And this was a model that I'm playing with. I have another sort of explanation about this using bounded context, but I started to think about this in terms of chemistry and like what is pulling on certain things. And again, a lot of you guys can validate or invalidate this, but I tried to put this together as the big actors in this problem, right? You have a service that's being pulled in many different directions, but you also have an application. In terms of the application is of course pulled directly to that end user, and that's the value that you're focusing. And a service can help you get that way. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But in terms of the business requirements or the industry requirements, something like encryption or compression or document storage or some of these things that the business that may want you to consolidate, but on your path to the end user, you're feeling the resistance of having to move in a different way because it's not maybe defining that same benefit to your end user. And I think the counter argument to this is, well, you may need to just get a little bit more creative about how you're thinking about the value to the end user. But these are real prevalent actors in what we're building. And even this industry is really important. With Corelogic, it's a financial services industry entity. And so it falls under a lot of these regulations. What do we know about regulations? They institute fear amongst the enterprise, right? And how do we govern fear? We govern fear with conservation, and we make sure that things are not scary, and if they're somewhat scary, we just err on the side of caution to make sure that we're not exposed and liable in the same ways that other people are. So, from the service perspective, you get more of a direct correlation with these different actors. And we started to think about, well, yeah, we've got the end user that we're traditionally thinking about for application development, but maybe these guys are users in our particular service that we need to think about. If we're serving only one of them, we're not serving the others, and maybe that's a problem as well. Again, I wanted to turn this again on a different side. It's like we talk about bounded context, and the bounded context, again, with these four different actors sort of create the shell that's around the context of the service. So I know that's a lot. Are there any questions so far? Sort of barreled into this long story. All right, we'll keep going. So I love this idea of spelunking, and we actually use Splunk in our logging, but that's a different story. But we talked about this as a pathway. So like how am I supposed to envision, how do I describe this? And I have to do a lot of talking about this to other people. We sort of thought about this as like, if you look at the top of a cave, you're the service, and you're looking down, and there's this dark cavern, and you're saying down there is user value. Like that's where I have to go. And I have to traverse these like different applications, and there's twists and turns, and there's many different allegories for this, but what the point was is that we were trying to shoot, and what we'll talk about and what we did with our discovery and framing was try to shoot all the way through, get as far as we can into that unknown, to get to where that user value is, and then start pulling ourselves back, because we're going to start to be able to navigate. And as you Splunk, you're going to go down one path, you're going to light a candle or something, and trace your way back. So you're starting to map out all of these unknowns, right? But the part is respecting and observing that there is this vast unknown that you're looking in. There's no light. The only light is from whence you've came. So that's just another analogy for what we're trying to do here. And then to create these different personas, these people that are not necessarily people, but as we saw in the previous presentation, like machinas or machinas or however you'd want to pronounce it. We have application end users, which is always what we want to focus, but you can traverse through the application and these non-consuming users to create real value out of your services. Yes?
What is a non-consuming user?
So a non-consuming user, the question was, what is a non-consuming user? A non-consuming user are these actors that aren't necessarily looking to use any aspect of your service or application. Great example is the enterprise. In our case, building something like an encryption service, information security is not a direct consumer of the encryption service, but definitely an actor in how that service would be made. And the other part would be maybe even just the financial industry, because the financial industry will have regulations that will dictate the level of strength that you need to encrypt in order to satisfy most of your clients' requirements. But they don't care what you're going to do with that encryption service. If you mailed it off to that entity, they're going to say, great, sounds awesome. Like, go have someone else use it. But they will dictate about how that service is going to be created. So now we're going to step into what we looked at, changing the process in a better way. Not being so brazen and arrogant to say we can remove things. The process works because the process is proven over many different use cases. And so what seemed to be the more appropriate challenge was make the process appropriate for what you're trying to do. So follow all of the steps. And that led us into this technical DNF, right? We've heard a little bit about this. I tried to enumerate some of our steps that we went through. So we'll go through a little bit of this, but with services, it was really interesting because if you think about one team supporting many different things, we were trying to figure out how could we get to the tangible needs of things that have been well thought out. And so we tried to identify the needs of our applications that existed, the ones that have done things a certain way because they will have real world experience in their needs and surrounding a solution with their needs. The near existing applications have probably regimented understanding of what those needs could possibly be, but they may not have tried them out in the real world, and they can be really outlined. Where it gets a bit nebulous is when we talk about committed ideas. So committed ideas are these things that are on their way to being congealed into actual applications. And where I think this is really interesting, it sounds like something that would cause caution, like future-proofing, where you'd be thinking, well, I'm thinking about things that haven't actually happened yet. But what we're trying to do is to get a little bit more validation in the procedures coming through. In this existing application, you may be dealing with that term legacy. And that term means that we have an application that has been sustained for a long time. And while legacy means a great thing, that you built something that lasts for a long time, it may not be the most relevant thing for today. If you're looking, you can balance that out with these near existing applications, which are ideas that are coming out of the ideas of today and the needs of today. And you can see where there's differences lie. And committed ideas are a little bit about those needs that are coming. And we still want to focus this on the near term. It's not like I'm going to build I don't want to say just an encryption service in space, but take the tacit analogy for what it is. Like something that's way out there, way in the future. Let's say brain encryption, like being able to encrypt my actual biological data in my actual head. That's like way too new. Like that's way too out of the league. We don't really care about that right now. But if you have a committed idea, it's actually coming out of this like burgeoning need. Like a need that is just sort of nascent to the world, but is still waiting to be shaped. And it actually can help you shape that because you then become an actor in this application on how it delivers value to the end user. And also we wanted to set this purpose of the service. And I think that this actually sounds like it's sort of, again, yeah, you obviously need to do that. But we have these single responsibility rules. You want to figure out that thing that your service is going to be delivered. If it's a document storage solution, you want to store documents, you want to retrieve documents. If it's an encryption service, you want to be able to encrypt, decrypt, maybe do something like key rotation. But you want to sort of set that purpose at a high level. And my background is a lot in humanities. I was a religious studies major. And I love this concept of really getting at purpose and setting a philosophical landscape for your software because it allows you to explore new areas within a certain bounded context. And setting the purpose will help you do that. And then finally, reviewing the DNF materials or interviewing those target users. So what's great about a service is if you're dealing with an existing application, and it's an application coming out of this type of process, there's already materials for you to pour over. There are these great personas that have been created to deliver that need. Why would you go back and actually interview those users? You can at least start there, and you'll be able to see what those end users actually need. And the interviews, when you're interviewing the target users, maybe that target user is going to switch with the implementation, the user that implemented that solution. So you're talking to a developer about what they've done for that integration to understand what their needs are at that next level. Because remember, we're shooting down and we're coming back. So when we come back, we're at the application level, and we need to understand what those needs are of that application. And also, your stakeholders. Your stakeholders could be applications themselves, other third-party integrations, but even the people that are the non-consuming users. So we spent a lot of time interviewing users that dictate encryption policies for encryption. We interviewed people that deal with contracts when we're talking about identity management. We looked at all of the actors in the system and started to realize what actually goes into creating services in these particular systems. So we're understanding a lot of the universe. And I actually have a diagram about what that actually looks like as you're going through it. And we constructed our own personas. So we had personas about auxiliary roles. So in the case of entitlements or cloth. We looked at contract provisioners because that actually dictated a way that this information about access and entitlements would get into our system. So we had to understand a little bit about what those roles were, what those needs are, and what the difficulties were. We used scenario maps, and I felt in the technical DNF, scenario maps worked well because it was easy for us to take a piece of information, whether it would be the long interview notes that would be delivered from the interview people, or even the scenario maps from other users, and we started to tail them to what our service can actually deliver. And the one thing that I'll say here is that you're going to find these demographic data to be probably a lot obvious at that time. But one thing that we started to do is ask more questions about that demographic data. And that can actually lead you into new areas in which you may want to reach out and actually reconduct the interview at the point of view of the service. And then the fifth part is to, incept as you're doing the conversions, tease out the MVP from all of this work. And we're starting to get back into the mode of how we're getting back to that DNF process, and then we're actually ready to work. So the one thing about this that I wanted to mention was, in terms of what's been talked about with the balance team, with services we felt that even in this DNF process, the balance team was essential. And the reason is that we had so much technical expertise on integrations. A lot of this stuff has to do with down-low integrations. It helps to have a developer-to-developer conversation in which the PM can tease out different aspects of it, but the drive to get to some of those answers was really helped out with having developers on it. So we've had developers on 2 of our DNFs, our entitlements and our encryption, and I definitely recommend it because it's definitely a different perspective. And the thing that I've sort of teased out about all of this process is a melding of different perspectives. From pairing on down to the DNF process, we get a lot of perspectives, and that becomes a lot of data and even interpretation, because we're literally divining what these needs are out of all of the notes and the pouring of data. Having multiple perspectives allows us to get to those conclusions and be broad with our interpretations. So I really think that that's the biggest thing out of that DNF. And it turned out to be shorter. In one case, it might be longer, but the point is, you should still do it because you're developing an application for users, right? So this is how it changed, right? We thought, when we started out with the brazen approach, we recognized that the universe was real big. And we said, we'll build a smaller universe. We said, that's no big deal, right? When we applied the DNF to this, so I forgot my order of my slides, but we'll talk a little bit about who our actors were. So we started to get at a little bit of what these applications were. And you see, we took directly what these personas were from the applications. We just looked at who they were, and we took whatever we had. As we moved over and did the DNF, you can see we had about the same number of users that we were looking at, but we had different types of users. We were looking more at the true personas of what these different applications were going after. And you could see that we had 5 process-driven users as opposed to just the laundry list of applications that we would be trying to support. So the DNF forced us to look at this holistically and got us to a point where we were really thinking more about the process that we were trying to affect, because that's the actual substance of our problem, and not necessarily just the applications that we're trying to integrate with, which is just you don't have users, you're only solving an enterprise problem, and you're just plugging it into, you might be a square peg, but if it's a round hole, that's their problem. They're still going to have to work with you, right? And a lot of that sort of subtly gets into who dictates how you integrate. And previous services, if you've noticed, sometimes they're very opinionated with what your method of integration with them is. So making this change, we also saw more of our stories in epics. I like to say this. We had lots of CRUD in the backlog, tons of CRUD. We basically said, oh, we'll CRUD all the things. That's amazing. That develops our epics. And as we started to write this out, we're like, holy crap, there's a whole lot of work that goes on there. And then we had these really large stories, which was basically create a user. And in terms of what we were dealing with, because we didn't have the whole picture about what we were trying to integrate with, that user object was even nebulous. didn't have a real concise definition across all of our applications. Some things, and we were looking at replacing a legacy system, so of course we made that mistake of saying, well, a legacy system has all the relevant information. We should just use what they had, right? And that's not necessarily the case. So you're talking about 10 to 50 different items, and maybe using about 10 to 25% of those things. So scratched all that, and we started to put together these like simpler, more direct users stories and epics. We talked about. I'll sort of leave Oracle EBS integration out of that because that actually turned out to be a really nasty integration. But these other things that we talked about with organizations, users, contracts, packages, and products, again, reflecting on what the process is. What are we trying to gather out of this information? We talked more with the contract provisioning process, and it made sense for us to just maybe do some of these things. Like we talked about what we didn't need to do. There was no need to delete a lot of the things. There was a need not to necessarily create packages and products because those were coming in from another system. And so we had these really, really nice epics and stories that we were able to act on. And we looked at integrating with some of our third-party components and entitlements. It was Oracle and Ping Federate. And then we also had some other integrations with like UAA, which we did with service authentication. And then we built our normal authentication and authorization epics. But what you could see here is that as we talked about our universe, we actually constructed a much larger universe than was needed. So this small piece was actually what we needed to deliver. And we took those learnings with something we had with document service, and we were able to at least start here and build a smaller service that served the needs of today and not necessarily try to establish what was needed maybe from the enterprise perspective or from what we viewed to be what the legacy application did. So this allowed us to really take some more ownership of affecting the process. And this is something I really haven't talked about, but it's subtle. Because as you're doing all of this DNF, what you're also understanding is the pain that exists in this process. I put that subtle line between the process to indicate that it might be separated or broken. And you may find that. You may find that there's inefficiencies in that process that need to be affected. And as you're talking to the apps, you get a lot of that because prior to this, services were sort of imposed on applications. And there was no real way that they could push back and say, I just don't want to do this. So what you end up doing is you end up doing subversive type of activities where you do things a certain way, or you may use the service only to check the boxes, but not in the intended spirit. Doing a lot of this allowed us to attack what that value was in the service for what the service was delivering. And again, the same tools that we were using to build applications, we were doing this. So I wanted to conclude here with our lessons learned. And the anecdote I like to give here is with the Fire Phone. Does anybody know the story of the Fire Phone? Does anybody remember the Fire Phone? Mike, I know you probably, it's real funny. I'd love to bring someone up here with a mic and tell a story, but I'll just sort of tell my interpretation. So the Fire Phone was this fantastic new phone that Amazon launched, and they said, you know what? We've got a Kindle. What if the Kindle was in a phone? Wouldn't that be amazing? And it wasn't. And one of the things that I read about it was there was this presupposition, like Jeff Bezos said, I really think that Amazon needs to have a phone. And he says, you know what? I know everything that phone needs to do. So you guys just meet with me. You take all of your information to me, and we'll build this fantastic phone. And they had some really slick marketing campaigns with the two kids buying a house. I thought that was pretty cool. But overall, this was a phone built for Jeff Bezos. So how many Jeff Bezos are there in the world? Yeah, there might be one. Law of numbers might state there might be two, because there's a lot of rich people as well. But point being, market share is not going to be as great for if you're looking at that Jeff Bezos market, then you got 100% of it. But if you're not, if you're trying to get to any type of other reach of the phone, you're just not going to get there. And this was a supreme public failure, I say, based on arrogance and just presupposing that you know what the user's needs are. And I sort of allude that too to the mistakes that we made on the Corelogic side was being really arrogant and understanding that we knew, one, how we could adjust this process to fit our needs, and two, how we could work around this thing that we sort of had users, but yeah, that's a tacit sort of thing. We don't need to really focus on the user. We need to focus on delivering these service capabilities for the enterprise. So I came up with this concise set of lessons with really fun, like I guess, little fun phrases for them. So the first thing, and this is one that was really hard to swallow, was to fill up on the humble pie. Really, really take into account that you don't know what you don't know, right? I love that picture of the man brazenly walking into the wrong bathroom. It just totally sums up where we were. We thought we knew that universe, and you saw we had drawn a very concise line around it, but it was still way too big. And this is a really good thing that the process sort of evokes, is to unearth assumptions and to interrogate assumptions. And really what I like about this is a lot of the things, you may know me, if you've talked to me before, I do like to talk and converse about things. Like, it really taught us how to have good conversations with each other on the team, and also have really good conversations with other business units and even managing up. Because we were able to talk about these assumptions and interrogate them, not necessarily in an accusatory way, but just sort of bring up and say, was that really true? Because this is what the data's telling you. We interviewed applications, we looked at their personas, and there's counter arguments to what we're trying to build. The second thing is to expand the universe, and in going through a lot of our exploration with how we're building services, we felt the pain of dispersion. And I use the pain of dispersion just to realize, like, you can go out wide, and we've all done this with the DNF process, but when you sort of get out of the reach of your arms, you start to get a little anxious and apprehensive, right? If you start to realize that you're spreading faster than you can comprehend, it causes a little bit of a frustration. And what we had to do was sort of just jump into it, right? We had to follow some of the leads that we had, just like we were in a cave that was completely dark. We had to find those paths and isolate those paths and understand what we were getting at. Because at the end of the day, when we got down to the end of those processes, we found value. And you could see it in the way that we've architected a different type of entitlements process, because we understood this balance between the application in contrast with what the enterprise needed. And it did create a lot of dispersion, because at some points they were on opposite ends of the spectrum, and you've got to explore all of those needs. This one, I don't know if any of you guys have read Chris Matthews. I grew up in the DC area, so politics is really big. He has a book called Hardball, and I think the second chapter is that all politics is local. And I think this is a really good thing, because what that talks about is, it talks about how you relate to the people that are around you in the certain situations that are around you. If you're a politician, you've got to sort of be a chameleon, and you got to meld to the audience, right? In this sort of scenario, we wanted to understand the personas of the application and then be able to step back. So you got to get really immersive, almost like method acting, into those personas and understand what that world is. Because services, as you know, is going to be sort of an epicenter for many different applications and many different personas. And you really want to try to understand that as deep as you can with the time that you have. And you want to be also to learn how to speak in their language and then translate from their language into your language. Good example, again, is identity and access management, as we're talking about something like single sign-on. Single sign-on has a lot of loaded terms and a lot of misunderstandings about what certain things mean. So you have to listen to where your users and applications are coming from, be able to translate that into what you're trying to deliver. So it is about sort of being a chameleon to those types of needs. And I like this last one. This is also a dated reference. I'm just showing my age all over this presentation. Channel your Bryant Gumbel. So Bryant Gumbel was a big interview in like the 90s and 2000s. Did a lot of fancy interviews on, I think, the Today Show for a while. But this was basically a lot about like all the team members getting out and conducting user interviews for new personas and integrators and consumers. Like, you want to be able to talk about your service and talk about the needs that your service can deliver. I know we've all sort of saw this in the technical DNF, but the difference here is that everybody on the team does this. We launched a conventions repo in which we're talking about the best ways that you can interact with our services. And what we've done from a developer to developer standpoint, and some people can attest, like with Order Center and Document Service and the entitlements team, we're learning how to like ask about our needs. Like, what do we need from a service? What do we need from the different library that's being integrated in with our app at the lowest level? And really, it's about having these like deep conversations that sort of hinge on need and what actions we can take to better support. But we've changed a lot of the way that we've conversed over the past 6 months. It seems to be more on the order of challenging these other teams to use the service and explore the service, and then also react very quickly, understanding and consolidating what those needs are and those interpretations based on what we deliver. And exhibited by what I'm doing today is getting to the podium and talking about, and this is really not just standing in front of a podium talking to people about your services, but as you review and talk in different scenarios, tech reviews, email, Slack, all of these things, if you feel that there's some need that's being expressed out there, you always want to be able to talk about your service, because the more people that are integrating, and part of this is you have this understanding more about how the process is working around you. So people may not know all of the actors in the situation, but you will, as a service provider, you want to be able to interject some of those comments in here as well. From the Corelogic perspective, the tangible evidence we have of this is our contract provisioning process. Not a lot of our applications know about what that process is, but us building an entitlement service, we got exposure to the contract provisioning applications, the process, what needs to be done to onboard users, because that's relevant to us. And we become a channel for that information as we integrate with other applications, because at some instance they may ask, well, why do I need to worry about products in certain states? And products are entitlements that are delivered at a contract level for Corelogic. Why do we need to deliver those things? And you as a service developer, you can communicate with the app developers. As a service PM, you can communicate with the PMs about this process. It's all about education and conversation. So that leads us to the end of the presentation. Are there any questions about what we've talked about today? John?
So Jeff, when you talk about driving that picture of the cake, putting it at the bottom, is that the same thing as doing thin slice development? Is it about trying to do a minimal thing, or is there something else?
So it's more of a conceptual look, but if you think about it in terms of the practical thin slice development, it actually does put together more of a structure. So our challenge on thin slice development, I think it's a great question. We had to figure out, what does it mean for the service to interact through all the channels? The first time that we started that, we realized that those thin slices were actually really thick because of all the areas that we had to address. And so one of the things that helped us in thin slice development was creating examples of how to use our application. And so to answer your question, to develop these thin slices, we tried to provide examples and patterns. So if we needed to do something like retrieve a document, we built a thin, lightweight, vanilla sample application that would allow you to do that very easily. It does two things, right? Allows me as a PM to have a nice way to accept stories as opposed to going into Postman or curl, which I like doing, but it's more of a hobby than an actual profession. The other thing is that when the apps come to integrate and they're like, WTF do I do to get this service working? You have a nice example. The contrast to this is maybe you just want to integrate with one app first. And I would say, hold on there, Charlie. You may not want to do that. Why? Because you're integrating a mature app with your service that's going to have its special needs that are going to be baked into what that is. So if I'm a new greenfield application and I want to go look at another mature application's problem, and I'm saying, WTF do I do? All I'm going to do is add now to that. So WTF do I do now? Because this looks really complicated. And you know what the next thing about that is I don't want to use it, right? So in order to do this thin slice, you got to think of creative ways that allow you to accept the problems. And that actually is a larger topic as well. We talk about acceptance. In this sort of microservice world, accepting is really, really technical at some times. We have had to use Postman, we've had to use curl, and to get our different responses right. But that's okay. And I think part of this is to think about where that value is coming from. Because at the end of the day, if the developer is seeing value, he's probably going to see value in some more of the technical acceptance. So it is just something that you may have to do.
Were you able to use those small projects that you created as some form of documentation or something for these greenfield guys that you were just talking about?
Yes, but not in the traditional sense. So we do have references to those examples in our GitHub repos. So wherever we can refer to it, we do. And inside those applications, I think they're pretty well commented, where you can actually see what we're doing and where we're doing it. So to answer your question, it's like not in the formal sense where we say like, hey, you're just going to be in here, but there are avenues that sort of drive you to that. Sure.
When do you build a new service instead of fixing an old one?
Oh, that's a great question. I will tell you as soon as we solve that problem. It's actually a really good thing that we're talking about it right now. So there was another topic I wanted to jump into, which I know you guys are probably familiar with, the app continuum or the product continuum. There's like this service continuum that I feel is sort of like building out of this thing, and like, how do you know when you have multiple services running? How do you know when the right time is to rev it? Like, how do you deal with that critical mass of need and actually perform the revs? And then how do you decide when to do a new service? And I think the answer, like, I hate to like do a cop-out answer and say, well, it depends on your situation. So with your situation, we'll have to figure that out. But I think, as we're exploring what this means, we're going to find more of a methodology on how we actually make those decisions. But right now, like, the needs are pretty well contained. We do see a lot more action in certain areas, and we're just trying to reason out what makes sense for the team. So I'm sorry that's not like an awesome answer. Anything else? Well, thank you guys for the time. I hope you had a good time with us. Feel free to talk to me at any time. I sit over in the corner.